Welcome back to AP World History. We're now going to take a look at our final part of the Age of Revolution by looking at the Latin American revolutions and the other revolutionary movements that happen because of these revolutions. So, just as a refresher here to show you what the Americas look like, um, you can see what territories Spain believed they controlled, and then they claimed it as well, so they kind of controlled it but not fully controlled it, and what Portugal controlled in South America as well. Portugal's not really going to be a part of this discussion here with what we look at. They'll break away later, and then also Mexico we won't go into too much. They break away on their own accord too, shortly after the American Revolution, and they don't really join in the Latin American revolutions here. So theirs is a little different as well. We're going to focus more on Latin America, so these areas, southern parts of Central America, and then the green parts and lime green parts of South America. And also as a reminder, if you look at the chart over in the top right, you can see basically how things broke down based on race. And so the majority of people are some type of Indian, while you have some Peninsulares and Creoles taking up almost another 1/4% of the population. And then you have a the mixed races of mulattoes and mestizos, and then you have some Africans. But the majority of the race, or the majority of the population, is Indian, and then you have Creoles and Peninsulares behind them, with those mostly being Creoles, which are the white kind of ruling families or white elites in the Americas. So, Latin America, why does this happen here? Why do they want to break away from Spain finally? Well, they're inspired by all the revolutions they're seeing with the American, the French, and the Haitian revolutions. And the French Revolution has led to a major weakening of the Spanish Empire because Spain gets conquered by Napoleon. And then Napoleon's brother is put in charge of Spain, and the colonies don't recognize him as the ruler. Instead, the Creoles see this as an opportunity to break away and then rule their regions for themselves. And at the same time, they see that they can exploit the natives because the natives want to break away and have a more fair system that incorporates them into it and allows them to have some voice and have some and be able to participate in government and not be abused and not be treated as only slave labor. And so the Creoles and the natives will eventually unite and start to resist the Spanish. And so they fight all across Latin America. They fight through Colombia and Peru, Argentina, all these regions. And they're primarily led by two people. The most notable person is Simon Bolivar, who you actually saw in the previous slide. And then the second most notable person is San Martin. Both are very charismatic men. Both are able to get a large following behind them. And they are able to lead the men in battle and produce victories, or at least make it enough to where Spain doesn't want to try to control them anymore. And these two also promise that the Indians will be treated better, there'll be more equality, they'll gain more freedoms, and they also might suggest a little bit to women that things might change a little bit there, or in some cases women just join the cause hoping that they'll be able to latch themselves onto it and gain their freedoms, or gain more freedoms and more rights that they would like to have, like equality to men. And so what happens here is after several years of fighting, in some cases decades of fighting, the kingdoms, or the Simon Bolivar and San Martin, eventually get all the regions to be broken away from Spain by 1830. And Bolivar's goal was to unite the South American regions and what will later become the countries that we see today, and unite them and make them the United States of South America, similar to what the United States is like. However, because of geography, infrastructure, and the differences in culture of the regions, that does not happen. And because that doesn't happen, these areas get weaker. The economies of these regions plummet because they don't have Spain propping them up and helping them out and making sure things happen. They also get kind of taken out of the world trade in some instances. And so that leads to some loss in power at home and in finances, and that will lead to also political power being lost, and will lead to a lot of instability in these countries that will then lead to a lot of corruption. And after all this as well, the natives remain fairly much in the same spot as they were when things started. Maybe a few more rights here and there, but really uh, things are maintained. The status quo is maintained because the Creoles don't want to give up the power they have, and they like controlling the government and controlling people, and don't want to give that up. And is that the best thing to do? No, but can you blame them if they're given the opportunity to control a much larger territory? Maybe not. Okay, so this is Latin America. This kind of ends the revolutions that we're going to look at. There are more revolutions that happened throughout history. We could dive into the Mexican Revolution. We'll do that a little bit in class, but not much here. We'll eventually see a Russian Revolution that will happen for some similar reasons as we see with these. And so keep these revolutions in mind, and really the main focus with these is make sure you kind of know how they go in order, so that the American Revolution leads to the French leads to the Haitian, and the Haitian and French revolutions lead to the Spanish American or the Latin American revolutions. Now, these revolutions aren't the only revolutions that happen, or changes in thought. Really, maybe we should say movements instead of more revolutions. And so there are three movements that we're going to look at that come about because of these revolutions. The first one will be abolitionism, second one will be the rise of nationalism, and the third one will be the rise of feminism. And so abolitionism, what that is it's the idea that there shouldn't be any slavery, and this becomes really popular at this time. It was actually becoming popular before the American Revolution, but after the American Revolution, some people are starting to see that they're kind of like hypocrites and saying, well, we should all be equal and no one should be above another, but I should be able to have slaves. And they realize that's maybe not the best thing to be saying, and it is somewhat hypocritical. And so some people start fighting it. You have people like a guy who we'll see later, David Livingstone, who will really try to push for the abolition of slavery within Africa. He's actually going to be a little bit after this time. Well, he's after the time period that we're talking about right now, within this time period. But he's a little bit later in the exploration of Africa and the colonization of Africa. And so you have people like him, though, that are also working in the Americas. You have large organizations trying to fight it. You have whole newspapers trying to fight it. And what will happen is the Europeans will eventually say, okay, you know what? We're done. Portugal and Britain will break off their selling of slaves, and Britain will try to stop anyone else from selling slaves on the open seas. And Latin America, as soon as they gain their freedom, they will end slavery, but slaves aren't a huge part of the population there. The Caribbean islands will maintain their slaves for a good while, though, because they need them for the sugar plantations, but they'll eventually go away. And then the big thing here is the U.S. is really different in all these, in that other than Haiti with the revolt, none of these are really violent. However, the American Revolution is very violent, and you have the North versus the South, and let me go back a couple steps. Not the American Revolution, but the Civil War. And so the U.S. Civil War is a violent, bloody contest to figure out, well, should you be able to own slaves or not own slaves in America? And the final outcome says no. However, that didn't necessarily lead to equality between Africans or freed slaves and free white people or the white population. That doesn't really happen, and you can still see some effects of that today in our view of things, or how people are treated. And then the last part is this abolitionist movement will also spread to Russia eventually, and Russia will end their practice of serfdom. Kind of. We'll talk about that more when we get to the industrialization piece of this unit and what they do there. So, abolitionist movement comes about because this is actually kind of around a little bit maybe before some of these revolutions, but it really starts to pick up after these revolutions. On top of this, the rise of nationalism comes about, and this is something new. This is something that comes out of Napoleon. and the French Revolution and trying to unite the French people and say, hey, you know what? France is awesome, and we need to back it up and protect it as best we can. And so that leads them to go and fight many wars. Napoleon will conquer almost all of Europe, but again, he invades Russia towards wintertime in 1812, and you don't invade Russia. It's not a good thing to do. You don't win unless you're the Mongols, and even then you don't fully conquer Russia. But that's a whole other Norton story. And so nationalism, if you don't know what that is, that's pride in your country. It means you're willing to go and fight and sacrifice yourself for your country. And again, Napoleon kickstarts this because, one, he spreads it in France, but then this idea spreads to the new nations he conquers, and they realize that, hey, we're Austrians, we shouldn't be under French rule, or hey, we're Germans, and we should all be united in our own German country. And so that will lead to Italy and Germany finally uniting later on in the 1800s. We will talk about those guys as well as we progress through this unit and the unification process that happened there. But it stems from this idea of nationalism, which stems from this time period in the founding of, with the birth of the Age of Revolution, and people questioning their government and also wanting to say that they also love their government and will do anything for it. And so the last one here is going to be feminism. Feminism won't take a huge, how do I want to phrase it? It doesn't become a huge movement right away. Are there a lot of women that participated in it early on? Yes, many upper class women try to participate in it, but it doesn't become the movement that you might think of as the women's suffrage movement or the right to vote movement as we see in the 1900s, especially the early 1900s and the late 1800s. That's not happening yet. They're just getting organized now at this point in time. And so they're basing some of their ideas off of the Enlightenment. One of the major figures of that is a lady named Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a philosopher at the time, and argued that men and women can do the same things and can be closer to equal than they are currently at that time, or than they were currently at that time. And then they take these views, and we'll go and visit a place called Seneca Falls. This is where some of the leading women in the United States go to discuss and try to gain the right to vote. Unfortunately, they do not win that. It doesn't happen. But it starts that movement. It starts that discussion. And so this will be a slow process. We'll see women keep protesting and keep trying to get to that level where they can finally be more equal to men, whether it isn't just voting or whether it's in rights that they have. But they slowly make their way there, but that won't be again until the late 1800s, early 1900s.